Welcome to this webinar. I'm delighted so many of you could show up. I'm Swanee Hunt, and about 6 or 7 years ago we started Political Parity as an initiative of our foundation, Hunt Alternatives, because we were really interested in the fact that not so many women were in the U.S. Congress and in the governor's seats. I say we were really interested, distressed, and we wanted to find out why that was and what to do about it. And Carrie Healy, God bless her, who had been lieutenant governor under Mitt Romney, she joined with me as the co-chair looking at this. And we had Marnie Allen, an organizer of this program par excellence, to work with us, putting together a leadership team with about 50 women from Republican and Democratic positions, mostly non-elected, and then also spawning this research to figure out why aren't women being elected? What are the barriers? What are they saying? What would help? And would it make a difference in Washington? Are they functioning any different? And that's where this research comes from. Now, I want to give a different perspective than you'll hear otherwise on the research, and that is that I've worked in about 60 countries. And in those countries, I've been working with women leaders and asking them if they would run for office. Some of them were in Afghanistan, some were in Liberia, thinking about running, and then what was it like for them to run? And one of the things that we found working in so many countries is that when you get a deadlock, a gridlock in the parliament or at the negotiating table to end a war, what you do is you build up what we call the confidence building measures. And those may be any kind of social interaction that the people who are going to be in these situations may have. So you're going to hear a lot more about that in this research. And I mean, let's face it, Washington is a war zone. And I'm very excited about what Jennifer Lawless and Sean Theriault have come up with in their discovery. It wasn't actually what we were looking for, and that often happens in research, is you discover something else. So thank you again for joining us, and please, as we complete our formal initiative, please keep going to politicalparity.org, because that's going to be a vibrant website that is kept alive by your contributions as well as more from us.
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Political Parity's webinar on sex, bipartisanship, and collaboration in the U.S. Congress. Thank you to Ambassador Swanee Hunt for her longtime support and vision in establishing the Political Parity program, which has really strived to understand questions of women's representation at the highest levels of government in this country, the barriers, the opportunities, and really what does it mean to change the face of politics in America. Obviously, questions that have tremendous relevance today, looking both at the presidential race as well as with congressional races across the country where we have female candidates making active runs for office. So I'm pleased to be the moderator this afternoon, and I want to take a moment before I introduce our researchers on this project to thank the Ford Foundation, which provided generous support for this research. Their vision and guidance for many decades, and most recently in the last several years, working with Political Parity and Hunt Alternatives, has been tremendously helpful as we shape the work that we're doing. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our two researchers on this project, Jennifer Lawless and Sean Theriault. They've been excellent partners and voices in this field for a long time, familiar faces to many of you, I'm sure. And I'd like to introduce them a little bit formally, say a few more words about the research, and then I will turn it over to the two of them to share some of their findings. So Jennifer is a professor of government at American University, where she also directs the Women in Politics Institute. She received her doctorate in political science from Stanford University and her BA from Union College. Her research, which has been supported by the National Science Foundation, focuses on representation, political ambition, and gender in the electoral process. She has written several books, including Becoming a Candidate, Political Ambition and the Decision to Run for Office, and she's the co-author of Running from Office, Why Young Americans Are Turned Off to Politics. as well as Still Takes a Candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office, which of course was the sequel to It Takes a Candidate, a book that many of you know has been foundational in the field in understanding why women do or do not choose to run for office. Jennifer's work has appeared in many academic journals, and she's also a nationally recognized speaker on electoral politics. So we're really pleased to have her here today. Her scholarly analysis and political commentary have been quoted in numerous newspapers, magazines, television programs, and radio shows, as well as the Political Parity webinar you're about to listen to. Sean Theriault, her collaborator on this research, is a professor of government and the University Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Texas. So he brings a different viewpoint for us, and one that is particularly relevant. The folks may have a few questions about some of the election results that we just saw this week. Dr. Theriault received his doctorate in political science, also from Stanford University, his MS in public policy analysis from the University of Rochester, and his BA from the University of Richmond. His research focuses on decision-making in the U.S. Congress, so you can see why there's so much relevance to the questions that this research has looked at. He's published 3 books, The Power of the People, Congressional Competition, Public Attention, and Voter Retribution, Party Polarization in Congress, and the Gingrich Senators, The Roots of Partisan Warfare in Congress, which we certainly have seen grow extensively into large branches and trees recently. Dr. Theriault has also published numerous articles in a variety of journals on subjects ranging from presidential rhetoric to congressional careers and the Louisiana Purchase. So a broad spectrum from these 2 researchers. And before I turn this webinar over to hear from them specifically, I just want to talk a little bit about the motivation that Parity had going into this project and why we were so thrilled when Jennifer and Sean came to us with their proposal. As many of you may recall, about a year ago, a group out of Harvard University called Quorum released findings showing that women were more collaborative in the legislative process. And they had a fairly limited data set and some analysis, but what they found was that women were introducing more pieces of legislation, sponsoring and co-sponsoring more pieces of legislation than their male counterparts. And so we really wanted to dig in and try to understand what was going on, what was the motivation behind that, how could that be understood, and would those results hold up under a more strenuous test. So we have asked Jennifer and Sean to really look at, and they came up with a very creative set of analyses to try to get at what so many of us have heard anecdotally, that women are more collaborative. Look at the government shutdown, and we saw several women senators from both parties sort of paraded across the news headlines, playing critical roles in getting to a deal, in reaching agreement and bringing the government back. Those of you who live in Washington, when the large snowstorm came this past winter, it was the women senators who were seen first back at the Capitol, back to work, back to business. So we see this narrative in public, and it's certainly been something that has motivated Parity over the years, this idea that having more women in office changes the way things get done. And so what we wanted to understand was, well, how, to what extent, and why, and what does that really mean? So Jennifer and Sean's work was really an opportunity to provide some quantitative analysis to match some of these qualitative anecdotal examples. And they have looked at some new ways to understand women's behavior in Congress and what bipartisanship means in the current era of a very partisan gridlock situation. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer and Sean to share their research, and then we will have the opportunity throughout. You may post questions on Twitter using the hashtag #MarchToParity, as well as in the webinar chat box. And once the research presentation is done, we'll pick back up and open for question and answer. So thank you both, and Jennifer, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you very much. We're excited to be here today and to share some of the research that we conducted. I think the best place to begin is to spend a little bit more time developing this conventional wisdom that Marnie alluded to. So we know that right now, nobody likes Washington, D.C. Congressional approval and trust in government are at all-time lows. It's difficult to find anybody that thinks Congress is doing a good job. And in head-to-head polls and matchups, very, very unpopular things such as lice and colonoscopies actually rank higher than the US Congress. Members of Congress might take a little bit of solace knowing that meth labs and North Korea rate lower than them, but even if you look at some of these margins on the right-hand side of the screen, pretty unpopular things give Congress a run for its money in terms of the lack of popularity. And so what we decided to do was assess what has become a commonly touted solution. Most people say Washington is broken, it needs to be fixed, and a common way to fix it is to elect more women. And electing more women is thought to bring about positive change through a three-step process. So step one is this general sense out there in the ether that women in Congress develop social relationships with each other, and they're more likely to be invested in building the social fabric of that institution. So generally, this sense that women try to get to know each other and they tend to like each other. And we don't have to look very far for examples of this. Here's a photo of a bipartisan White House dinner. Women on both sides of the aisle are meeting with Barack Obama. Here's a photo of a bipartisan trip to the theater. You'll notice that it's women in the Senate who joined together for this outing in December of 2010. Here we've got an annual bipartisan softball game. On Capitol Hill, the men play an annual game where it's the Democrats versus the Republicans. But every year, the women come together and they're one team and they play the media. So we have many examples that seem to suggest that women do, in fact, care about developing these friendships. The second step, though, is that these social relationships will then instill a sense of trust and cooperation even across the aisle. In other words, the upside to getting to know each other, getting to like each other, and becoming friends means that there will be a sense of trust and cooperation, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And according to women in Congress, this is actually what happens. Donna Edwards, who's now running for the Senate but is in the House, has said, softball has become really important to me. It's such a wonderful way for us to get to know our colleagues. Amy Klobuchar, Democrat from Minnesota. The 20 women in the Senate have formed such strong friendships of trust. Those relationships are going to make a difference as we get into what matters. And across the aisle, Susan Collins, a Republican from Maine. Women span the ideological spectrum just as men do, but we're more likely to collaborate and to realize that we can disagree on an issue, but still seek common ground. So in other words, these friendships actually generate a sense of trust across the aisle. And that leads to the third step as part of this conventional wisdom, which is that that cooperative spirit, that sense of trust, will trickle down to the legislative process. And women will then work together and be more inclined to solve problems, less inclined to generate them. And again, it's very easy to find examples of this out there when we look at popular commentary and political analysis. Women are the only adults left in Washington was a Time magazine headline right after the government shutdown. A woman's place is making Washington work. That was U.S. News and World Report. A group of bipartisan women sitting around discussing the ills that plague the institution. And as Marnie alluded just a couple of months ago, women actually showed up and worked during the blizzard in Washington, D.C. I should note also that for those of you across the country, many of you would not actually have deemed this a blizzard, but I digress. So this is intuitively appealing, right? Women like each other. They develop these friendships. These friendships generate a sense of cooperation and trust, and that trust then makes them solve all of Washington's problems. Obviously, we need to elect more. That is the solution, and that's how Washington will work again. Our main question, though, is, but really? Because at the end of the day, we know that party polarization is the most important thing that determines how people behave in Washington. We know, for example, that whether you have a D or an R in front of your name is a much more important predictor of how you will cast a ballot on a substantive vote than whether you have a Y chromosome in your DNA. And that's only gotten stronger over time as the parties have increasingly polarized. In the US Senate, there are stark differences that have been found between the parties that far exceed any gender differences on specific issues. And that's even the case when we look at traditional women's issues that have to do with women, families, and children. Other scholars have found that the sex of a member of Congress does not predict his or her roll call behavior. And that was the case, again, also on roll call votes in the 108th and the 109th Congress. So although there seems to be this general sense out there and the prevailing view that women and men are fundamentally different when it comes to how they operate and how they problem solve in Congress, the limited data that we have suggests that Maybe that's not the case. So what did we do? Well, we tried to analyze this commonly touted view in a series of ways. And I'm going to talk about the first data set, and then Sean will talk about the second and the third. So the first data set involved measuring empirically whether women, in fact, are more likely than men to engage socially with their colleagues, because that's the most important thing to determine whether they're going to then work differently and build this sense of trust. And to do so, we actually looked at two pretty unconventional data sources. The first is the Secret Santa gift exchange. This was started by Senator Al Franken in 2011, and he describes it as a good way to cut through the partisan divide. Basically, members of the Senate are assigned a different member to buy a Christmas gift for, and there's then a reception where they exchange gifts, and it's meant to bring about some sense of collegiality. The other example we have is Seersucker Thursday. This was created by former Senator Trent Lott in the 1990s, where all members of the Senate are encouraged to show up for work wearing seersucker suits. And he said, some might call it frivolous, but it actually helps us get things done because it's a fun activity where there's buy-in among the participants. Now, there are no official records of these activities, but through newspaper accounts, phone calls with different congressional offices, conversations with Trent Lott and the Senate historian, we were able to assemble rosters of who participated in these two events. Now, it's important to note before we turn to the data that we chose these events because they're open to both women and men and to Democrats and Republicans. We can't just analyze photos of women playing congressional softball or attending a bipartisan theater outing when there's no comparison point for men. It's just not newsworthy if men get together and go have a drink or go to a ball game. It is newsworthy when it's women doing that. So we needed to identify activities that were open to both women and men on both sides of the aisle. And we can begin with Secret Santa in the U.S. Senate. So long story short is the data bear out our expectations. If we look at the percent of women and men participating in the gift exchange, we see that in 2011, women and men were equally likely to participate, about 40% of both. But over time, women's levels of participation have grown, men's have decreased a little bit. The important thing to note from this figure is that women's participation rates always either match or exceed those of their male colleagues. The same is true when we turn to Seersucker Thursday in the Senate. Notice in 2004 that women's participation rates really exceeded men's. I should note that in 2004, that was the first year that women were encouraged to participate. And that year, Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California, actually offered to buy seersucker suits for all of the women. That seems to have been effective because, as you see, throughout the years following 2004, women's participation rates went down. But importantly, their participation rates always exceeded those of their male colleagues. So at least in terms of that initial step that's required for the conventional wisdom to work, the step that suggests that women care more than men about building social engagement and contributing to the social fabric of the institution, these two data sets suggest that, sure enough, we do uncover evidence for that trend. I'll now turn it over to Sean, and he'll talk about the other two data sets.
Having seen a little bit of validation for step 2 in the 3-step process, we decided to go ahead and look at some more systematic evidence to see if this was having an effect in the legislative process. So the second data set that we collected were procedural votes in Congress. So these includes the House resolutions that set up the rules for debate on particular pieces of legislation, time limits, the amount of amendments, who controls time, the type of motion to recommit that might be offered at the end of the debate. It also includes motions to adjourn, motions to instruct conferees, cloture motions to restrict the filibusters in the U.S. Senate, and motions to table of the amendments. We can think of all of these things as not either passing legislation, nor are they changing the wording of legislation. Rather, they're just setting up the parameters under which the House and the Senate will be debating particular pieces of legislation. The reason that we wanted to gather these was to see if sorry about this, is to see if the members if the male and female members had a distinction in how they voted on these types of bills. Our hypothesis heading into it was that if, in fact, men and women had different roles in the legislative process, then we might see it borne out in the votes that they take on these procedural votes. So you take all of these votes to try and come up with some type of procedural score. But first, a little bit about the votes. So we looked from the 93rd Congress to the 113th Congress, and we coded all of the votes that occurred in the House and on the Senate on the floor. So that included almost 25,000 votes in the House and almost 16,000 votes in the Senate. Once we took out the procedural votes, we looked at how each individual member voted on each of these different procedural votes. So in total, it's 7,202 votes in the House were deemed procedural in nature, and 6,792 votes in the Senate. We then put all of these votes into a statistical program that it will come up with a particular score for a member. So an easy way to think about this is imagine putting all of those different members in a spreadsheet, and then the spreadsheet will find the two people that disagreed the most. And then it would array everyone else along the continuum about how much they agreed with the person on the far left and how much they agreed with the person on the far right. And we do this both for men and women at the exact same time to see if there's some type of distinction in how women are voting on these procedural votes relative to men. In the continuum, we can think of as existing from -1 on the far left to a +1 on the far right. At the endpoint are the members who most disagree. And then the algorithm replaces all the people in between. And so when we look at how men and women voted on the various Congresses, this is going from 1987 to 2004, we see that the vote scores don't differ much at all from the 110th to the 113th Congresses. In a couple of Congresses, it looks like there's a bit of a gap, but when you look at these two trend lines, it seems as though men and women, while they vary from year to year, men and women are always very close to one another in how they vote. And this is the House Democrats. We will now look at the House Republicans, and we see that the lines are even tighter, more tightly close with each other. Again, from 1987 to 2004, where women are just a little bit more in the moderate direction, at least in the beginning of the series. But by the time we get to the middle, it's as though the two lines completely overlap. So that's in the House. We don't see much difference either in the Democrats or in the Republicans with respect to how they're voting on procedural votes. So with that, we'll turn to looking at the Senate. First, the Senate Democrats. We see that at least initially, the women in the Senate were actually more likely to cast more extreme polarized procedural votes than the men. But again, by the time we get a third of the way through the time series that we analyzed, it looks as though the two lines almost are completely overlapping. And then to look at the Senate Republicans, there's a bit more variation in how the women are voting relative to the men, in year-to-year variation. And the gap appears to be just a little bit bigger in that the women, at least in the Senate, are voting a little bit more moderately. But in looking at these data, you don't have to study the lists of women Republicans in the Senate very long to see the overwhelming effect that Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe, the two senators from Maine, who are known for being two of the most moderate senators, are having on these data. So in more statistical tests, a bigger statistical test where we include other variables and we isolate the effect of Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe, we don't find that the remaining Senate female Republicans vary much at all from the other men. So the third data set that we analyze are amendments offered in the Senate. And much like the social engagement data set that Jen described, we wish that we could come up with good alternatives for measuring stuff in the House, but because of the different legislative procedures that the two different chambers use, there isn't a light data set that we could use. In the House, amendments are very restricted by leadership. The Rules Committee has a big role in determining who can offer amendments and when they can be offered. So it wasn't a very good test to see if women collaborated in a different way than men did in the floor of the House. And so we isolate this data set only to looking at the Senate, which has a much more freer amending process. Typically, the way that the Senate operates is that any member on most pieces of legislation can offer amendment if they want. And what we've seen over time is that a strategy developed where instead of filibustering a bill outright or instead of trying to defeat a bill outright, instead people in opposition to a particular bill will just continue to offer amendment after amendment after amendment. And unlike in the House of Representatives, where you can take an electronic roll call vote and have it finished in 5 minutes, in the Senate, each one of these amendments that have to have a roll call vote, it can be as much as a half hour for the presiding officer to read through the entire list of all of the senators and find out how that they're voting on each of these particular amendments that we analyze. So there are a variety of different reasons, though, why senators might offer amendments. One of those might be to move a bill closer to their preferred policy. Of course, if the bill is way outside of where they would like it, offering an amendment could simply bring it closer to their ideal point. A second reason that someone might offer an amendment is to provide an opportunity for maneuvers that can skirt the standard legislative process. So in the Senate, there is no germaneness rule, so any senator can offer an unrelated amendment to a bill that is going to pass otherwise, and by offering that amendment, and if that amendment is voted up, then you, in fact, can pass your legislation through amendment rather than having a standalone bill on the Senate. And finally, the third use of amendment is as, and here we're quoting Senator from Montana, as a crass political stunt aimed at making a 30-second commercial. This is what Max Baucus is saying in as Tom Coburn, a senator from Oklahoma during the Obamacare debate, was offering an amendment that said that nothing in the bill that no money in the bill could be used to give child molesters Viagra. So it's famously known as the Viagra Amendment. And Max Baucus calls him out on this as the only purpose for which offering this amendment, which couldn't be allowed by the underlying piece of legislation anyway, was to form a 30-second commercial that could be used against Democrats in the next election. So we want to look at the amendments that senators offer and try and figure out if we can see if the number of amendments that someone's offering and then demanding a particular roll call vote on them gives us some indication into whether or not they are a problem creator. We can imagine a particular senator perhaps offering a couple of amendments over the course of a legislative session and doing so for solely benign reasons. But if someone's offering 30 or 40 different amendments during a particular legislative session, it can't be that they want to move every single piece towards their most preferred policy, but rather it suggests to us that they might have a more nefarious purpose. And so we wanted to look at the number of roll call votes that are coming from individual senators' amendments that they're offering on the Senate floor. So in total, from the 103rd to the 113th Congresses, we coded over almost 4,500 different amendments that were offered over this time period. And when we look at the Senate Democrats and we look at the number of roll call votes that are occurring on different senators' amendments, again, we see slight variations in a couple of different Congresses, but the broad sweep of the line certainly indicate that, at least among Senate Democrats, there doesn't appear to be much difference between the number of amendments that women are offering differing from the number of men offering, at least in among the Democratic Party. Looking at the Republicans, again, we see a bit of a difference there as we get closer to the 110th, 111th Congresses, but for the broad sweep, again, of the trend that we're looking at, men are offering just slightly more amendments than women are over the entire time period. So when we look at both the House and the Senate procedural votes, we're making 28 comparisons, that being 14 different Congresses and 2 different parties. So 14 times 2 is 28. And then in the Senate amendments, we're looking at 11 different Congresses, 2 different political parties. So there's 22 different types of comparisons that we're trying to make between men and women and how they engage the legislative process. And the number of gender differences that we see is good number of statisticals that are statistically significant. But yet, when we look at the number that are consistent with the conventional wisdom, that women are more faithfully engaging either in the legislative process as we operationalize with procedural votes or in offering fewer amendments, we see that it's a tiny percentage of the total number of possible comparisons that we are making over the time period. So to summarize our conclusions and implications before we turn to your questions, which we're quite eager to see and hear, women might contribute to a more civil culture in Congress. They're more likely to show congressional spirit and to do so across party lines. This conclusion we're deriving from the data sets that Jen described and some of the findings that she went through. And there seems to be something normatively attractive about getting them to do so. It could be that just engaging in these social aspects, whether or not it's a bipartisan book club or Seersucker Thursday, it could be that that it's making it a more attractive place for women to run. And as Jen's previous research indicates, that's one of the biggest barriers to why we don't have a higher proportion of women representing in the House and the Senate. But it's perhaps unrealistic and unfair to expect that women will govern differently because of the overwhelming power of party leaders and the increased party polarization that we've seen occurring over this time. So at least in how men and women are engaging the legislative process, we don't find much evidence at all that men are any different in their problem solving relative to women. And it seems as though women are just as procedurally polarized as men are.
Great. Sean, Jen, thank you so much for sharing that research with us. And I just want to remind all of the participants that there is a question tab on the left-hand side of your player. You can submit questions for us there, and you can also submit them on Twitter at #MarchToParity, and we'll do our best to take those questions and answer them. Jen and Sean, I just want to ask you, obviously a lot of this research sort of runs counter in that last slide that Sean showed to some of the conventional wisdom around how women behave in leadership roles. Can you say a little bit about what you think might be different about Congress than some of the other situations that researchers may have looked at, whether that's women in business leadership roles or in other political roles, such as in the governor's office or at state houses, which, because of a balanced budget mandate or other things, tend to be a bit more collaborative than Congress is?
Well, as far as other realms are concerned, I think partisanship is the biggest difference. We have a situation in the U.S. Congress where you know what team you're on. You're either a Democrat or you're a Republican. And over time, those parties have become increasingly polarized. So there's far less room for the sex of a legislator to affect any kind of substantive or even procedural vote, because you care more about making sure that your party gets what it wants. You care less about making sure that the institution as a whole comes up with an outcome. And if both sides are not willing to compromise and play together nicely, then neither side has an incentive to do so. And so consistent with other recent research regarding how women and men campaign when they run for Congress, regarding how the media cover them when they run for Congress, or even how the voters evaluate them when they run for Congress, this further demonstrates that the party ID, the party identification associated with that member, tells us far more than the sex of the legislator does. And that's not going to be the case in business or in law or in any other professional setting where it's not clear that being one team or another team structures the entire institution's behavior.
So do you imagine that if we had done this study 10 or 20 years ago, obviously the number of women was substantially less, the data collection, and might have been a little bit more challenging in terms of getting to statistical significance, but do you think the results might have looked different? Women's behaviors have been forced to change to adapt to the political situation that's grown more polarized.
Right. Some of the research coming even out of the 1960s, 70s, and early 1980s even showed that there was a difference in how especially Republican women voted relative to Republican men. So at a pretty fundamental level, we saw that there was a difference in how men and women were engaging, at least with respect to roll call votes. But we can imagine that as the parties polarize and as party leadership becomes more important and as the primary season becomes the more competitive for lots of different members of Congress, how it would be harder for women to maintain that distinction over time. And so by the time that we're starting to collect these data, we're already in a pretty ossified Congress where to be a Republican meant that you had to be pretty conservative, and to be a Democrat, likewise, you had to be pretty liberal.
Okay, thank you. So we've seen in the recent book by J. Newton Small sort of focuses on sort of the outsized impact that women may have in terms of bringing legislation forward and introducing it into the legislative process. Can you talk a little bit about how that process works and how that might relate to the findings from this research in terms of whether or not women may have, is there a way for us to look at and understand whether women, some of the social relationships and sort of understanding of issues and interests on the other side might relate in terms of introduction of legislation or championing certain pieces versus how women are actually behaving as legislation moves through that process?
You know, I think that J. Newton Small's book, Broad Influence, is an excellent example of highlighting some very, very unusual cases where women really did behave fundamentally differently than men and that it mattered in a positive way. So examples like the government shutdown, examples like discussions over the Violence Against Women Act, examples like the women getting together and working through the blizzard last month, are important, and they're true and they happen. But the reason that we wound up coding more than 40 or looking at more than 40,000 procedural votes and several thousand amendments was to determine whether those high profile examples are really indicative of a broader pattern. And in fact, they're not. So part of the reason they get so much attention is because they're unusual, because they're newsworthy. So we don't in any way want to suggest that those examples aren't important or that they're not true. They are, but we're pretty confident in our results that those effects just don't seem to be the status quo. They don't seem to be the norm. They seem to be the exception to a broader rule.
And to add on even what Jen alluded to earlier, so imagine if Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell get together and come up with some type of solution for some budget ceiling or a government shutdown or something. No one would ever write a story about how the men of the Senate are solving problems. And so when men get together to solve problems, it's just not newsworthy in the same way that it is when a group of women do. And so that's why we thought it was really important to gather lots of data systematically over time to see if we could tease out these differences that at least are suggested by some of these media stories.
Great, thank you. I have a question from one of our listeners who asks, did you consider coding some of the amendments for context? And if you did, or if you thought about that, would you expect to see either more or fewer differences depending on the substance of the bills being debated?
Yeah, so what we've gathered here is we like to think of as a first cut on the Senate amendment stuff. So certainly we'd like to very much code the policy categories for the amendments. But perhaps even more important, we think, is coding how the individual senators are voting on these amendments. It would mean something to us if people who are offering 2 or 3 amendments over the course of a Congress are getting 80% approval, as indicating that there's broad bipartisan consensus on the amendments that they're offering, versus those senators who are offering 35 and 40 amendments, not attracting any support whatsoever from the opposite side, especially if they're offering them as minority party members. Because of course, if you can't get any votes from the majority party in offering amendments on the Senate floor, then the only purpose must be something nefarious, because there's no possible way that you could possibly move policy towards your more preferred direction. So I think it's a great question. It's something absolutely that we'll be examining in greater detail here going forward with the project.
One thing I would add, though, is remember early on when we sort of set up the conventional wisdom, a lot of research has focused on substantive votes and whether women and men differ in terms of their substantive policy preferences or the issues that they bring to the agenda. And over time, any of those gender differences have pretty much dissipated as well. There aren't moderate Republicans left anymore to behave in a way, for example, that Connie Morella did in the late 1990s, and to cross party lines and work with women on the other side. So the research that exists finds little support for the idea that there are different gender differences on substantive votes. One of the main contributions we wanted to make was to assess whether these gender differences on procedural votes or how the game is played or how a bill becomes a law are the same as substantive votes, or whether we do in fact find gendered patterns. And we just came up short.
Yeah, okay. So I know that many of the folks who tuned in this afternoon were probably looking or hoping to hear a little bit more hopeful news. I'm curious just for your reaction to these are patterns that you both have studied for a long time. Is there anything in the research that for those of us who are proponents of broadening the participation in politics and sort of who our representatives are, that we might take out of this research to sort of strengthen our arsenal of arguments for people who say, in fact, it doesn't matter because the Congress is so polarized that it doesn't really matter who you are coming in and what you bring to the table, you're going to be sort of overwhelmed by the system. So
I think there are 2 positive pieces of information coming out of this, and Sean might have more because he's far more optimistic as a person than I am in general. The first is that we did find substantive effects when we looked at social engagement. The evidence was pretty clear that women are more interested in building the social fabric of the institution. And that matters because it could convince more women that running for office is not the worst thing in the world, that there are people around who care about having good relationships, who care about developing friendships, who care about appearing trustworthy. And so some of the cynicism that potential candidates might have toward the political process can be mitigated when we look at the fact that women systematically are more likely than men to care about behaving nicely. The other thing that matters here is that it suggests that we should not be holding women up to a higher bar when they run. And I think that matters. Often we know, for example, that women are far more likely than men to doubt their qualifications to run for office. What we see here, though, is maybe more evidence of why they don't have to. They behave the same way. And if voters don't hold women up to a higher bar, if voters don't expect women to solve all of Washington's problems, that actually might be a good thing in terms of encouraging women to run as well. In the last slide, we said we think it's somewhat unfair to expect that when women go to Washington, they're going to get congressional approval up into the 80s and change the way the world works. This kind of research, I think, can disseminate that message and, again, perhaps encourage more women to throw their hats into the ring because the demands are not going to be Herculean.
The one thing that I would add, and of course I am a bit more optimistic than Jen, is that what we've seen in the research is that, first, the entire time period in which we're examining the data that we presented this afternoon is during a polarizing era. And what we know is that there used to be a bigger distinction between how men and women engaged the legislative process, both in the issues that they were addressing and in the roll call votes that they were casting. But over time, of course, the demands of party leadership ended up swamping any gender differences that we might have seen. So perhaps if we're at the top of the polarization triangle, if you will, and things start loosening up a little bit, I mean, I think everything that we thought of in politics is undergoing a fundamental reevaluation in light of the presidential campaign. So if party leadership starts to loosen loosen the restrictions on their individual members, it could be that the female members are the ones that are more quickly going to start exhibiting different behaviors again. And in part, we just have to wait until we're in a depolarizing era instead of a polarizing era to see if that's actually true.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, we could say that, right, they were the last ones to join the partisan war, and so they could be the first ones that stop engaging in the partisan war. Yeah,
great. So to follow up on that, Sean, do you think that there's some sort of threshold effect that we might see? You know, certainly when you look to other countries, it seems as though there's a tipping point. You know, there's no difference when you have women at 10% or even 15% of a legislative body, but when they hit 25 or 30 or maybe even 40%, that things change. So is it possible that if we were to dramatically increase, or even maybe it's just slightly increase the number of women in Congress, that alone might be sort of the key to begin this depolarization?
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with some of that research as Jen would be, so I'm sure that she'll tell me where I'm wrong in this. But it seems to me even if we increase the number of women in the legislature, we're going to be creating a more hospitable environment for more women to even join. And so you could imagine at some point that the number of times that people are going to the bipartisan concerts or playing softball together, or maybe they'll start playing basketball with each other, that eventually that could have some type of an effect. But it certainly seems that as long as the voters are going to be casting such party line ballots, as soon as someone's ideology matters so much more than whether or not they're a problem solver or a problem creator, as long as the voters are kind of demanding that strict partisanship and ideological underpinnings of their individual representatives, it sure is going to be hard, even if it was more than 50% women in these legislatures, right? The change has to start with people casting ballots in elections. And again, if we've learned anything over the last couple of weeks, it certainly seems like the trends towards creating a less hospitable place are increasing rather than decreasing.
I agree.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm glad we have that on film.
Great. So, Jennifer, let me ask you, one thing that you said that really struck me was this question of sort of the expectations that are set for women candidates, or even for women who might be possibly entertaining the idea of becoming a candidate. So can you say, that's certainly something that your research has looked at extensively, and I know there was research that came out last year that the Women Donors Network supported as well. looking at sort of the danger of putting women on a pedestal and expecting them to somehow be sort of pure and above the political system and separate from it. So can you elaborate just a little bit more on, how I know that there are many of the folks listening on this webinar are deeply committed to this idea of increasing women's political representation. So what sort of takeaways could they use? What sort of arguments might they be able to make as they're talking to women who are thinking about the idea of running for office?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that the biggest barriers to getting more women involved in politics right now are supply side barriers and not demand side barriers. When women run for office, they do just as well as men. When women run for office, they raise just as much money as men. And when women run for office, they receive very comparable media coverage to men. The presidential contest notwithstanding, and even there, we don't know what the analysis is going to look like from 2016. But at all other levels of office, and certainly at the congressional level in the last several election cycles, it's very difficult to find any gender differences in how candidates communicate, media cover them, or voters evaluate them. How then do we have so few women in politics when they're 50% of the population? The two biggest barriers are that women don't think they're qualified to run for office, and they're far less likely to be recruited to run. And we'd make the case that on both of those dimensions, it's important to disseminate findings like Sean and I produced in this report, because I think it will quell women's concerns that they need to be better, or that the expectations out there are that they're going to be fundamentally different. And I think it could also be important for political recruiters and political activists trying to identify women. They are just as effective, or in some cases ineffective, as men. And so if we're casting a wide net in trying to select men, we should be doing the same thing for women. This is not an endorsement of the notion that we should cast a wide net and find completely unqualified women as well. But it is to suggest that maybe we don't need to hold them up to such a higher bar. And that is the first step in ensuring that they don't hold themselves up to an unattainable bar as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's really critical. Two questions from folks who are listening in. One is whether or not either one of you, I pass this to you because I don't know the answer, know what this current election is shaping up to look like in terms of the number of women who are running. Are we seeing more female candidates on the House and Senate sides than in prior elections, similar or less?
About the same as the last few election cycles. So we're not in a position where there will be substantial gains, but by the same token, we shouldn't expect any kind of substantial net loss either.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Although everything that we know about politics a month ago is different today because of it. So.
That's very true. All right, so I want to end on this question, which is whether or not there are next steps. And Sean, you talked about a few in answering an earlier question, but what do you both think where would you go? Where would you like to see the field go with this research as a jumping off point to understand what else? Where would you dig deeper?
Well, in addition to what, you know what,
No,
Sean, you can take this one. No, it's fine.
Well, so the one thing that I was going to say is another data set that we're currently collecting is looking at all of the floor speeches on the Senate floor to see if the rhetoric that women are using is any different than the rhetoric that men are using. We would think of this as being a little bit in between the two data sets that we're currently examining. Of course, rhetoric at the end of the day doesn't really affect the underlying legislation and the words of the legislation as you might find in amendment voting or in final passage voting. But it's not quite the same as wearing a seersucker suit on a given Thursday. So we might see some differences there. Unfortunately, so much of the data that we wish that we could examine aren't available to us, right? Like it would be great if we could get who's placing holds on nominations and floor in bills in the Senate. Or it would be great to know who actually wants to offer amendments on particular bills in the House. But so much of that data just isn't known to us. It's easy to examine roll call votes to see if there's a difference between men and women. And that tells us a lot about the positions that they hold. But it's hard to get at how faithfully they're engaging the legislative process. You can't ask them, are you a jerk or are you kind? and so we can only try and get at that in looking at who's wearing seersucker suits and willing to buy a gift for someone that they might have to give to someone across the aisle.
And one other thing that we're thinking about doing is expanding these kinds of measures of social engagement, right? Like, we think it's cute that we now have, we're probably the only people out there with systematic data on Seersucker Thursday and Secret Santa, but it's unclear that anybody else would want that. And so we have started thinking about other creative ways to tap into whether you're collaborative. And for example, a survey of members of Congress, just asking them about their friendships, their relationships, other memberships, like in the congressional gym, could all together sort of tell a much stronger and build a much better picture of how engaged versus unengaged some of these members actually are. And so moving forward, we obviously need to come up with good examples and good indicators of whether they're playing in a gamesmanship way, but we also need better measures of social engagement.
Right, and right, to just add on a little bit of that social engagement, a data set that I helped gather for a different project looks at how members travel abroad and with whom they go. And so, right, we haven't added the sex variable yet to see if women are more likely to go on bipartisan trips, as an example. In about 2/3 of the trips that members take with another member are bipartisan in nature, and only 1/3 of them are partisan. And so we might see that women are more likely to go on these trips with members across the aisle than men would be. And so that could be an additional piece of evidence. And the nice thing about this is the House data are actually better for doing this than the Senate data. The Senate data, it's harder to figure out exactly who's traveling with whom, but the Senate has much stricter reporting requirements that allow us to make those kinds of comparisons.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you both again. Those are a lot of great ideas about where the field can go, and it really plays into something that I wanted to highlight, which is, as the Parity program is in sort of its final wrap-up, we have 2 additional pieces of research that will be coming out this year, and one of them was designed as a direct pairing to this study, which is looking from a qualitative perspective and trying to interview each of the female members of Congress, House and Senate, to begin to get at some of the questions that you both were asking. And there may be some ideas there, Jennifer, that we want to follow up on in terms of your membership to the gym and other things, but really to dig in on that question, Sean, of are they nice or not, and why? And were they when they came to Congress, when they first got to Washington? Has that changed over time? And what are they hearing from their constituents in terms of what matters to them? And is it strictly issues? Is it straight down party lines? Or are there a set of representational questions that matter for women in office differently than they matter for their male counterparts? And so I know that we'll invite the 2 of you to really be an active part of that research, which is being led by a team from COP, from the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers. And I know Kelly Dittmar was listening in on this webinar earlier, and she's taken a key role in driving that forward. But there's a lot of really exciting pieces to come out of this work that the 2 of you are both leading, that is happening elsewhere in the field. And I would encourage those folks who are still listening in on the webinar to continue to use the March for Parity hashtag online if you have other ideas of how you'd like to see any of the researchers engage in this work, what questions you have, what are your takeaways from this. The one other piece of research that Parity will be releasing this year is a study of where women run for office, historically where they have run, where they have won in their primaries and general elections, and trying to sort of understand the electoral impact of geography, electoral history, if a woman has won in that seat previously, if that's leading to some sort of pipeline or shift, whether by public perception or party gatekeepers or women who may be groomed by those candidates themselves. So that will be coming out later this year. The research with COP, we hope certainly will come out before the election in the fall. So I encourage folks to keep up the conversation with us, and anyone who's interested in seeing this research and really digging in more deeply to what Jennifer and Sean have done, it will be available on the research page on the Parity website. So thank you both again very much. It's really interesting to hear what you have found and to understand it more deeply, the implications it has for the field and how those of us who sit a little more on the activist side can really put this to use. So I want to thank you both for your participation and thank everyone for logging in today.